You watch as rivals undermine your reputation while smiling to your face, stealing credit for your work, and positioning themselves for the opportunities you deserve. Every day you play by the rules of honor and fairness, yet somehow you remain vulnerable to those who operate without such constraints, while others seem to effortlessly eliminate threats and secure their position through calculated moves. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the political strategist who served princes and republics, witnessing firsthand how power is truly gained and maintained in the most treacherous courts of Renaissance Italy. What I discovered about neutralizing enemies and securing unshakable power will transform how you navigate any competitive environment, giving you the strategic weapons to not just survive, but dominate those who would destroy you. The battlefield may have changed from Italian city-states to modern offices and social circles, but the principles of crushing enemies before they crush you remain as vital today as they were 500 years ago. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Machiavellian wisdom and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to learn the art of strategic dominance. Let me take you back to the moment my eyes were truly open to the nature of human enmity. I was a young man in Florence, working in the Second Chancery, believing, like so many naive souls, that merit and good intentions would protect me from harm. How foolish I was. It was 1498, and I witnessed something that would shape every principle I'm about to share with you. Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who had ruled Florence through moral authority and religious fervor, was being dragged to his execution. This man had commanded the devotion of thousands, had driven out the Medici, had seemed untouchable in his righteousness. Yet there he was, abandoned by his followers, betrayed by those who had sworn loyalty to him just months before. The very citizens who had burned their vanities in his bonfires now screamed for his blood. I watched as former allies testified against him, as friends became accusers, as supporters melted away like morning mist. But here's what struck me most profoundly. Savonarola's downfall wasn't caused by his external enemies. It was orchestrated by those closest to him. The Pope and the political powers certainly wanted him gone, but they couldn't have destroyed him without the help of people within his own circle. His inner enemies, the ones who smiled at his sermons while plotting his demise, were the daggers that found their mark. That day, I learned my first crucial lesson about enemies. The most dangerous ones are not those who oppose you openly, but those who stand beside you while sharpening their knives in secret. Savonarola trusted in the goodness of men, believed that his pure intentions would shield him from treachery. He died for that belief. I made a vow that morning, watching the smoke rise from his burning body. I would never be so naive. I would study the art of enmity as carefully as scholars study Scripture. I would learn to see the wolves beneath the ears, sheep's clothing, to recognize the subtle signs of brewing betrayal, to understand that in this world you are either predator or prey. There is no middle ground. This was my awakening to a fundamental truth that most people refuse to accept. Enemies are not aberrations in human society, they are inevitable. Every person of consequence will make enemies simply by existing, by succeeding, by taking up space that others want to occupy. The question is not whether you will have enemies, but whether you will be prepared for them. From that moment forward, I began my systematic study of power, betrayal, and survival. I observed how the strong maintained their positions and how the weak were devoured. I learned that good intentions without strategic thinking are nothing more than elaborate forms of suicide. The Medici seal I kept on my desk served as a daily reminder of this lesson, that even the most powerful families must constantly guard against internal and external threats, that complacency is the luxury of the doomed, and that understanding your enemies is not just useful knowledge, it is essential for survival. Now that you understand how I came to study the dark arts of human conflict, let me share with you what I discovered about the fundamental nature of enmity itself. Most people approach this subject with dangerous romanticism. believing that enemies are created by misunderstandings or moral failings. This thinking will get you destroyed. The truth I learned through years of observation in the courts and chancelleries of Italy is far more sobering. Humans create enemies as naturally as they breathe. It is not a bug in our nature. It is a feature. Understanding this is your first step toward mastery. I spent countless hours studying human motivations with the same precision that Leonardo applied to his anatomical drawings, just as he dissected cadavers to understand the body's mechanisms. I dissected human relationships to understand the mechanics of conflict. What I found will disturb those who prefer comfortable illusions about human nature. There are three fundamental drives that create enemies in every human heart: fear, ambition, and the zero-sum perception of resources. Let me explain each, because your survival depends on understanding them. Fear is the most primal creator of enemies. People will attack you not because you have harmed them, but because they believe you might harm them in the future. I have seen men destroy potential allies simply because they imagined future threats. Your success makes others feel insecure about their own position. Your competence highlights their incompetence. Your rise suggests their potential fall. They begin to see you as an enemy before you even know they exist. Ambition is the second great enemy maker. In any hierarchy, there are limited positions of power, wealth, and status. When you advance, you occupy space that others covet. Even if you take nothing directly from them, you have taken something they believed should be theirs. I watched this dynamic destroy countless relationships in the Florentine government. Men who had been friends since childhood became bitter rivals when both sought the same office. The third driver is perhaps the most dangerous: the zero-sum mindset. Most humans operate under the false belief that another's gain must equal their loss. Your promotion means fewer opportunities for them. Your recognition means less attention for them. Your success means they are failing by comparison. This thinking turns natural competition into personal enmity. But here's what makes this truly treacherous. These three forces create three distinct types of enemies, each requiring different strategies to neutralize. Open enemies are the easiest to deal with. They declare their opposition clearly. You know where you stand, and you can prepare accordingly. These are your honest competitors, your declared rivals, your obvious opponents. They may try to defeat you, but they do so within understood rules of engagement. Hidden enemies are far more dangerous. These are the people who smile at your face while plotting your downfall. They attend your celebrations while secretly working to undermine your position. They offer help while creating obstacles. They express concern for your welfare while spreading doubt about your competence. These enemies are the hardest to identify and the most devastating when they strike. Most dangerous of all are potential enemies, people who have not yet decided to oppose you but who harbor the conditions that could turn them hostile. They have the fear, ambition, or zero-sum thinking that could activate under the right circumstances. Today they may be neutral or even friendly, but tomorrow they could become your greatest threat. The tragic mistake most people make is assuming that being good, fair, or generous will prevent others from becoming their enemies. This is like assuming that being healthy will prevent you from catching diseases. Good character is admirable, but it is not armor against human nature. I learned this truth by watching both the rise and fall of countless leaders. Those who succeeded long-term were not necessarily the most virtuous. They were those who understood that enmity is inevitable and prepared for it accordingly. They didn't create unnecessary enemies, but they also didn't delude themselves into thinking they could avoid having enemies altogether. This knowledge is not meant to make you paranoid or cruel. It is meant to make you realistic and prepared. When you accept that enemies are a natural consequence of existing in the world, you can plan for them strategically rather than being caught off guard by their inevitable appearance. Understanding that enemies are inevitable is only half the battle. The other half, and perhaps the more crucial half, is learning to identify who your enemies actually are. This skill saved my life more times than I can count, and the lack of it has destroyed more promising careers than any external force ever could. Most people are terrible at identifying their real enemies. They focus on obvious competitors while missing the hidden daggers. They worry about distant threats while ignoring the poison being mixed in their own kitchen. They mistake loud critics for dangerous enemies while treating smiling saboteurs as friends. Let me share with you the system I developed after studying the rise and fall of princes, merchants, and courtiers across Italy. I call it Caesar's method, named after the great Roman, who could have survived if he had properly identified his true enemies among the senators who claimed to love him. The first category of enemies are the Brutuses, those who hide their enmity behind professions of loyalty and friendship. These are the most dangerous because they have access to your vulnerabilities. They know your plans, your fears, your weaknesses. They can strike when you are least prepared and in ways that cause maximum damage. How do you identify a Brutus? Watch for these signs. They ask more questions than they answer, always wanting to know your plans, your concerns, your strategies. They offer unsolicited advice that subtly undermines your confidence. They express concern about your decisions. While never offering concrete alternatives, they are quick to share gossip about others, but strangely protective when you ask them direct questions about themselves. Most tellingly, they are always present when things go wrong, but somehow never available when real help is needed. I learned to watch for this pattern during my time observing court dynamics. The courtiers who rushed to console a fallen favorite were often the same ones who had orchestrated his downfall. The second category are the Cassiuses, the ambitious rivals who see your position as rightfully theirs. Unlike Brutuses, they don't necessarily hate you personally. They simply want what you have and believe they deserve it more. These enemies are often easier to spot because their ambition makes them less careful about concealing their intentions. Cassiuses reveal themselves through subtle competition. They correct you in public forums. They volunteer for assignments you're handling. They make sure their achievements are visible when yours are being discussed. They build alliances with people who could influence your position. Most importantly, they position themselves as the obvious replacement whenever you face difficulties. The third category are the Antonies, those whose loyalty can be purchased or whose allegiance shifts with changing circumstances. These are not enemies in the traditional sense, but they become dangerous when opposing forces offer them better terms than you can. Antonies are identifiable by their transactional approach to relationships. Everything is negotiated. Loyalty is conditional. They keep detailed mental accounts of favors given and received. They have friends on multiple sides of every conflict. They are always well informed about who is rising and who is falling in the broader landscape. But here's where most people make a critical error. They focus so much on identifying enemies that they forget to categorize them by actual threat level. Not all enemies are equally dangerous, and treating them as such wastes resources and creates unnecessary conflicts. I developed a simple but effective threat assessment system. High-threat enemies have three characteristics: capability, opportunity, and motivation. They can harm you, they have access to harm you, and they want to harm you. These enemies require immediate and decisive action. Medium-threat enemies might have two of these three characteristics. Perhaps they want to harm you and have the capability but lack opportunity. Or they have capability and opportunity but lack sufficient motivation. These enemies require monitoring and preventive measures. Low-threat enemies typically have only one of these characteristics. They might dislike you but lack the power to act on it effectively. These enemies can often be ignored or managed with minimal effort. The most dangerous mistake is misassessing threat levels. I have seen people destroy themselves fighting low-threat enemies while ignoring high-threat ones. They waste energy on critics who bark but cannot bite, while sleeping peacefully next to those who smile and sharpen knives. Remember this crucial distinction. Not everyone who dislikes you is your enemy, and not everyone who smiles at you is your friend. True enemies are those who actively work to harm your interests, not merely those who disagree with your opinions or methods. During my years in the Florentine Chancery, I kept detailed notes on the loyalties and motivations of everyone I encountered. I tracked their alliances, their ambitions, their fears, and their capabilities. This intelligence network saved me from several conspiracies and helped me navigate the treacherous waters of Italian politics. The goal is not to become paranoid, but to become strategic. When you can accurately identify your real enemies and assess their actual threat levels, you can allocate your defensive and offensive resources efficiently. You can sleep soundly knowing you are watching the right people for the right reasons. Now that you can identify your enemies, you must understand the first and most fundamental law of survival in a world full of predators. Never show weakness. This principle is so crucial that violating it can undo everything else you do correctly. I learned this lesson by watching the destruction of leaders who forgot that in politics, as in nature, the wounded are always the first to be devoured. The metaphor that haunts me still is that of the wounded lion. I once witnessed a hunt in the hills outside Florence where the dogs had injured a magnificent lion. The moment the beast showed signs of weakness, limping, bleeding, struggling to maintain its usual dominance, every creature in the forest sensed opportunity. Jackals that had always kept their distance suddenly grew bold. Hyenas that had feared the lion's roar began circling closer. Even smaller predators saw their chance to claim territory they never would have dared approach before. Human enemies behave exactly the same way. They circle weakness like vultures circle carrion. The moment they sense vulnerability, limitation, or desperation in you, their entire relationship with you changes. People who once showed respect begin testing boundaries. Allies start questioning their loyalty. Neutral parties begin calculating whether opposing you might be profitable. I watched this dynamic destroy Duke Valentino's enemies one by one, and I also watched it nearly destroy Valentino himself when his own health failed him. The same courtiers who had trembled at his name began whispering about his weakness when illness confined him to his chambers. The same generals who had obeyed his every command started making independent decisions when they sensed his grip loosening. But here's what makes this law particularly treacherous. Showing weakness doesn't just invite attack from your known enemies. It creates new enemies from people who were previously neutral or even friendly. Success attracts allies, but weakness repels them. When people see you struggling, they begin to distance themselves to avoid being pulled down with you. This is not because humans are inherently cruel, though some certainly are. It's because we are inherently practical. People align themselves with strength because strength offers protection and opportunity. When you appear weak, you become a liability rather than an asset in their calculations. The challenge is that life inevitably brings moments of genuine weakness, struggle, and uncertainty. You will face setbacks, make mistakes, encounter problems beyond your immediate control. The key is learning to manage these realities without broadcasting vulnerability to those who would exploit it. I developed several strategies for maintaining an appearance of strength even during my most challenging periods. When the Medici returned to power and I lost my position in the government, I could have wallowed in self-pity or publicly complained about the injustice. Instead, I withdrew. Strategically, used the time to write and study, and emerged with new knowledge and capabilities that eventually restored my influence. First, control your emotional displays. Never let enemies see you panic, despair, or lose composure. I'm not suggesting you become emotionless. Emotions are part of what makes us human and effective. But save your emotional vulnerability for your most trusted allies, and even then, choose the timing carefully. Your enemies should see only calm calculation, even when storms rage inside. Second, reframe setbacks as strategic repositioning. When you face a defeat or obstacle, publicly treat it as a temporary inconvenience or even as an opportunity to pursue better alternatives. Sometimes this reframing actually becomes true. Many of my greatest insights came during periods of forced reflection that initially felt like disasters. Third, maintain your standards and expectations of others. When people sense weakness, they often begin taking liberties, arriving late to meetings, delivering substandard work, making demands they would never have made before. Continuing to hold high standards signals that your temporary difficulties do not represent permanent diminishment of your authority. Fourth, invest in your capabilities during difficult periods rather than cutting back on everything. When resources are limited, most people reduce their investments in learning, networking, and skill development. This is exactly wrong. These investments are what will restore your position when circumstances improve. Fifth, be extremely selective about whom you ask for help. Seeking assistance can signal weakness, but it can also signal strategic thinking if done correctly. Ask for help from positions of future strength. I'm exploring this opportunity and would value your expertise, rather than from positions of current desperation. I'm in trouble and need rescue. The most sophisticated application of this principle is learning to show strength through restraint, rather than through displays of force. A leader who must constantly remind people of his power probably doesn't have much real power. True strength is quiet confidence that doesn't need to prove itself through dramatic gestures. During my diplomatic missions, I noticed that the most effective negotiators were those who remained calm and controlled even when discussions became heated. They projected strength through their ability to maintain composure under pressure, not through aggressive posturing or threats. Remember, this law is not about being dishonest about your situation. It's about being strategic about how you present information. You can acknowledge challenges while framing them in ways that emphasize your capability to overcome them. You can admit mistakes while demonstrating what you learned from them. You can show humility without showing helplessness. The wounded lion who hides his injury lives to hunt another day. The one who limps openly in front of the pack becomes prey. In a world where enemies are always watching for opportunity, strength, or at least the appearance of strength, is not vanity. It is survival. After you have learned to project strength, you must master what may be the most difficult skill in all of human conflict: strategic patience. This is the ability to wait for the perfect moment to act against your enemies, even when every fiber of your being screams for immediate revenge or preemptive strikes. I learned this lesson the hard way, and it nearly cost me everything. In my younger days, when I first identified enemies within the Florentine government, my impulse was to move against them quickly. I believed that speed would give me the advantage of surprise. How wrong I was. Like a hunter who draws his bow too early and frightens away his prey, I acted before the conditions were right for success. My premature moves not only failed to neutralize my enemies, they alerted them to my awareness of their hostility and gave them time to strengthen their positions against me. I had turned a manageable threat into a formidable opponent through my own impatience. The metaphor that eventually taught me patience was that of the hunter's bow. A master archer understands that there is a precise moment when all conditions align. The target is in the optimal position, the wind is favorable, the hunter's grip is steady, and the prey is unaware of the danger. Acting too early or too late means missing the target entirely. Strategic patience in dealing with enemies follows the same principle. You must wait for the moment when your enemy is most vulnerable, when you have the strongest position, when the circumstances favor your success, and when the consequences of your action will be decisive rather than merely disruptive. During my years observing the political maneuvering in Italian courts, I witnessed countless examples of both successful patience and destructive haste. The most successful leaders were those who could endure provocation, insult, and even temporary disadvantage while they positioned themselves for ultimate victory. I remember watching Duke Cesare Borgia deal with a conspiracy among his own commanders. When he first learned of their plot, his advisors urged immediate arrests and executions, but Borgia demonstrated extraordinary patience. He continued to treat the conspirators as trusted allies while secretly gathering evidence, isolating them from potential supporters, and preparing alternative leadership for their commands. When he finally acted, it was with such precision and completeness that the conspiracy was not just defeated, it was obliterated. Every conspirator was eliminated, their supporters were neutralized, and their positions were filled with men of unquestionable loyalty. Had he acted immediately upon discovering the plot, some conspirators might have escaped, and the roots of rebellion could have regrown elsewhere. But patience is not mere waiting, it is active preparation disguised as inaction. While you wait for the perfect moment, you must be constantly working to improve your position and weaken your enemy's position. You gather intelligence, build alliances, develop capabilities, and create the conditions that will make your eventual action irresistible. I developed a systematic approach to strategic patience that I called the 3 preparations. First, prepare your capability. Ensure that when you act, you have the resources, skills, and support necessary for complete success. Half measures born of impatience create surviving enemies who become more dangerous because they know you are willing to move against them. Second, prepare your enemy's vulnerability. Work to increase their exposure while they remain unaware of your intentions. This might mean encouraging them to overextend themselves, to make commitments they cannot maintain, or to reveal information that can be used against them later. The patient strategist creates the conditions for his enemy's downfall rather than simply reacting to existing conditions. Third, prepare the environment. Ensure that when you move, the broader circumstances will support rather than hinder your action. This means timing your moves to coincide with favorable political winds, economic conditions, or social dynamics. It means building public opinion or institutional support for the justice of your cause. The most sophisticated form of strategic patience is allowing your enemies to destroy themselves while you remain apparently uninvolved. Many enemies, given enough time and rope, will hang themselves through their own arrogance, incompetence, or overreach. The patient strategist creates conditions where this self-destruction becomes more likely while maintaining plausible deniability. Employed this technique with several rivals who had more immediate power than I possessed. Rather than confronting them directly, I positioned myself where I could observe their decision-making and subtly influence the information they received. I allowed their own poor judgment to create the problems that eventually led to their downfall, while I remained ready to step into the void they created. However, patience must be balanced with vigilance. While you wait for the perfect moment, you must constantly reassess whether that moment is approaching or whether circumstances are moving in directions that require adjustments to your strategy. Static patience is as dangerous as impulsive action, though key is learning to distinguish between 2 types of delay: strategic patience that improves your position over time, and simple procrastination that allows your enemy to grow stronger while you grow weaker. True strategic patience always includes active elements: intelligence gathering, alliance building, capability development, or positioning improvements. When I finally learned to master this art, my effectiveness against enemies increased dramatically. I stopped creating unnecessary conflicts through premature action, and I started winning decisive victories through perfectly timed interventions. My enemies began to fear my silence more than they had ever feared my words, because they could never be certain when or how I might eventually act. The hunter who masters his bow rarely misses his target. The strategist who masters his patience rarely fails to destroy his enemies completely when he finally chooses to move. While patience teaches you when to act, the principle of divide and conquer teaches you how to act when facing multiple enemies or organized opposition. This is perhaps the most powerful weapon in the strategic arsenal, yet it is also the most misunderstood and misapplied by those who attempt to use it. The Romans perfected this art in their systematic conquest of the known world, and their standard became my model for understanding how division creates victory. They never fought all their enemies at once if they could avoid it. Instead, they isolated each opponent, turned potential allies against each other, and ensured that each conquest weakened the resistance of remaining enemies rather than strengthening it. I first witnessed the devastating power of this principle during the conflicts between Italian city-states. Florence found itself surrounded by hostile powers, Venice, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States, any one of which could have been a manageable opponent. But together, they represented an existential threat to our independence. Our salvation came, not through military might, which we lacked, but through careful application of division tactics. We identified the competing interests among our enemies, the historical grievances between them, the territorial disputes that made cooperation difficult, and the personalities that made alliance formation fragile. The key insight is that your enemy's unity is almost always more fragile than it appears. Groups of enemies are held together by common opposition to you, but they also have their own competing interests, mutual suspicions, and conflicting goals. Your task is to make their internal divisions stronger than their shared hostility toward you. I learned to identify 3 types of divisions that can be exploited: resource competition, ideological differences, and personal animosities. Resource competition is often the easiest to exploit because it involves tangible benefits that cannot be shared equally among conspirators. When enemies succeed in harming you, they must then decide how to distribute the spoils, and this distribution inevitably creates resentment and suspicion. Ideological differences run deeper and can be more permanent sources of division. Even when people agree on opposing you, they may have fundamentally different visions of what should replace you or what methods are acceptable for achieving their goals. These differences can be magnified through careful information management and strategic provocations. Personal animosities are perhaps the most volatile, but also the most useful divisions to exploit. When enemies have historical grievances, personality conflicts, or competing ambitions within their own group, these tensions can often be inflamed to the point where they focus more energy fighting each other than fighting you. The practical application of division requires both subtlety and patience. Direct attempts to turn enemies against each other are usually obvious and often backfire by confirming their suspicions about your manipulative intentions. Instead, you must create conditions where their natural divisions become more prominent and problematic. One effective technique is selective information sharing. You provide different pieces of information to different enemies, ensuring that each group believes they have special insight or advantage over the others. When they act on this information, their actions appear to be betrayals or power grabs to other members of the coalition. Another technique is differential treatment. You respond to overtures or negotiations from some enemies more favorably than others, creating suspicion about secret deals or special relationships. You don't actually need to make such deals. Merely creating the appearance that some enemies are being treated preferentially can fracture their unity. During my diplomatic work, I often employed what I called the favored enemy technique. When dealing with multiple hostile parties, I would identify the one that posed the least long-term threat and treat them with slightly more respect or consideration than the others. This created jealousy and suspicion among the remaining enemies, while potentially converting the favored party into a neutral or even friendly force. The most sophisticated application of division is encouraging your enemies to compete for the sure privilege of destroying you. This sounds counterintuitive, but when multiple enemies all want to claim credit for your downfall, they often begin undermining each other's efforts to ensure they receive proper recognition for the victory. I witnessed this dynamic during conspiracies against several Italian princes. The conspirators spent so much energy ensuring that no single member of their group gained too much glory from the assassination that they created multiple competing plans, failed to coordinate their timing, and ultimately revealed their intentions through their internal conflicts. However, division tactics must be applied with careful attention to long-term consequences. Successfully dividing your enemies today can create new problems tomorrow if you are not thoughtful about which divisions you encourage and which alliances you prevent from forming. The goal is not simply to create chaos among your opponents. It is to create divisions that serve your strategic interests. Sometimes this means ensuring that the strongest enemy becomes isolated from potential allies. Sometimes it means encouraging weaker enemies to exhaust themselves fighting each other. Sometimes it means converting some enemies into allies by exploiting their conflicts with your more dangerous opponents. I learned that the most effective division strategies are those that appear to happen naturally rather than through your intervention. When enemies blame each other for their failures rather than blaming you for your successes, division has achieved its ultimate purpose. The Roman standard represents not just military conquest, but strategic brilliance, the understanding that no enemy coalition is permanent, that every alliance contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that patient cultivation of these natural divisions can achieve victories that direct confrontation never could. When you master the art of division, you transform the greatest threat, organized opposition, into your greatest opportunity. Multiple enemies become multiple advantages as their competition with each other becomes more important to them than their competition with you. If divide and conquer is the sword of strategic warfare, then information control is the shield, the map, and the compass, all combined into one supreme weapon. In my years of studying power, I discovered that information advantage often determines victory more decisively than any other factor. The side that knows more, controls narratives better, and shapes perceptions more effectively almost always prevails, regardless of apparent disparities in resources or strength. The Venetian Republic understood this principle better than any other power of my era. Their network of spies, informants, and intelligence gatherers stretched across Europe and into the Ottoman Empire. Venice survived and thrived for over 1,000 years, not because they had the strongest armies or the largest territories, but because they knew more about their enemies than their enemies knew about them. I studied their methods obsessively, adapting their techniques for my own survival in the treacherous world of Florentine politics. What I learned fundamentally changed how I approached every conflict, every negotiation, and every relationship. Information is not just useful in dealing with enemies, it is the foundation upon which all other strategies are built. There are 3 dimensions to information warfare that you must master: gathering intelligence about your enemies, controlling the information your enemies receive about you, and shaping the narrative that others use to interpret events and relationships. Intelligence gathering begins with understanding that information has layers. Surface information is what people want you to know: their public positions, their stated intentions, their apparent capabilities. Shallow information is what they don't mind you knowing, but don't actively publicize: their concerns, their limitations, their routine patterns. Deep information is what they actively try to hide: their real motivations, their secret alliances, their hidden vulnerabilities, their genuine fears. Most people are satisfied with surface information and wonder why they are constantly surprised by their enemies' actions. Effective strategists systematically pursue deeper layers of intelligence through multiple channels and sources. I developed a network of relationships that provided me with different types of information about the same people and situations. Servants in great houses often knew more about their master's real thoughts than the master's closest advisors. Merchants who traveled between cities carried not just goods, but gossip, rumors, and observations about political dynamics. Women in court social circles possessed insights about personal relationships and private grievances that shaped public decisions. The key to effective intelligence gathering is understanding that people reveal different information to different audiences and in different contexts. A man might be completely honest with his confessor about his guilt, but completely dishonest with his wife about his fears. A woman might share her real political opinions with her closest friends, but present entirely different views in formal settings. Your task is to position yourself or your agents to access these different contexts and piece together a complete picture of your enemy's actual situation, intentions, and capabilities. This requires patience, subtlety, and the ability to ask the right questions in the right ways at the right times. But gathering information is only half of the equation. Controlling the information your enemies receive about you is equally crucial. This is not about deception in the crude sense of lying. It is about strategic revelation and concealment of truth. You want your enemies to know certain things about you: your determination, your capability, your support from others, your awareness of their actions. You want them to remain ignorant of other things: your specific plans, your timeline for action, your actual resources, your genuine vulnerabilities. The most sophisticated practitioners of information control reveal accurate information that serves their strategic purposes while concealing accurate information that could be used against them. This is far more effective than fabricating false information, which can be discovered and undermines your credibility. During my diplomatic missions, I often shared true information about Florence's military preparations while concealing true information about our financial limitations. Enemies who knew we were preparing for conflict but didn't know we couldn't sustain a long campaign made different strategic calculations than they would have with complete information. The third dimension, narrative. Control is perhaps the most powerful and least understood aspect of information warfare. This involves shaping how others interpret events, relationships, and motivations. The same action can be seen as strength or weakness, justice or tyranny, necessity or choice, depending on the framework people use to understand it. Narrative. Control begins with understanding that humans are storytelling creatures. We don't simply observe events. We embed them in stories that give them meaning. Your enemies will try to create stories that make you the villain, make your actions appear illegitimate, and make resistance to you seem righteous. Your task is to create competing narratives that frame your actions as necessary, your enemy's actions as destructive, and your ultimate victory as inevitable. I learned that the most effective narratives are those that align with existing beliefs and values rather than challenging them directly. If people already believe that strong leadership is necessary for stability, you frame your actions against enemies as providing such leadership. If people value fairness and justice, you emphasize how your enemies have violated these principles. The timing of narrative deployment is crucial. Narratives introduced before events occur shape how those events are interpreted. Narratives introduced after events must work against already forming impressions and are therefore less effective. During several political crises in Florence, I observed how different factions competed to establish their interpretation of events as the accepted truth. The faction that got their story out first, supported it with credible evidence, and aligned it with popular values usually won the narrative battle regardless of the objective facts. Modern applications of these principles are more relevant than ever. In any competitive environment, information advantages still determine outcomes. The person who knows more about market conditions, competitor strategies, and customer preferences maintains enormous advantages. The person who controls how their achievements are perceived and how their setbacks are interpreted can weather storms that would destroy others. Remember that information warfare is not about becoming a spy or manipulator in the sinister sense. It is about being strategic and systematic in how you gather, protect, and present information. In a world where perception often becomes reality, mastering these skills is not optional. It is essential for survival and success against those who would use information weapons against you. While the previous strategies focus on defeating enemies, sometimes the most brilliant victory is converting your greatest opponents into your most valuable allies. This transformation requires extraordinary skill and careful timing, but when executed properly, it not only neutralizes a threat but actually strengthens your position by adding their capabilities to your own. The olive branch backed by hidden strength. This was the symbol I kept on my desk to remind myself that true diplomatic triumph combines genuine offers of peace with unmistakable evidence of your ability to wage war. Conversion works not through weakness or desperation, but through demonstrating that alliance serves your enemy's interests better than continued hostility. I first learned this principle by observing how the most successful Italian princes managed their relationships with former enemies. Duke Francesco Sforza of Milan had once been an enemy of Florence, leading mercenary armies against our interests. Yet through careful negotiation and strategic incentives, he became one of our most reliable allies. The key was not in begging for his friendship, but in demonstrating that our success served his long-term goals better than our destruction. The first requirement for enemy conversion is accurate assessment of their underlying motivations. Some enemies oppose you for reasons that can be addressed through negotiation. They want resources you control, positions you influence, or security you threaten. These enemies can potentially be converted because their hostility is instrumental rather than personal. Other enemies oppose you for fundamental reasons that cannot be easily changed. You represent values they despise. You occupy space they believe belongs to them by right, or you possess qualities that make them feel inadequate. These enemies are poor candidates for conversion because their hostility serves psychological needs that alliance cannot satisfy. The most promising candidates for conversion are pragmatic enemies, those whose opposition is based on strategic calculations rather than emotional drives. When circumstances change or new information becomes available, pragmatic enemies can recalculate their positions and discover that alliance serves their interests better than continued conflict. I developed a systematic approach to enemy conversion that I called the 5-stage process. First, demonstrate respect for their capabilities and acknowledge their legitimate interests. This is not appeasement, it is recognition that worthy enemies have strengths you can appreciate and goals you can understand, even when you cannot accept their methods. Second, create situations where cooperation produces mutual benefits without requiring either party to abandon their core principles. These limited partnerships build trust and demonstrate that working together is possible without complete submission by either side. Third, gradually increase the stakes and scope of cooperation as trust develops. Each successful collaboration makes larger collaborations seem more feasible and more attractive. The key is ensuring that each step provides clear benefits to both parties so that neither feels they are being manipulated into a disadvantageous position. Fourth, address the underlying concerns that created the original hostility. This might involve redistributing resources, clarifying boundaries, providing security guarantees, or offering positions that satisfy their ambitions without threatening your essential interests. Fifth, create new shared interests that make the alliance valuable independent of the original issues. Former enemies who develop genuine common causes become some of the most reliable allies because they have already tested each other's resolve and capabilities through conflict. During my diplomatic career, I successfully converted several enemies. Using this approach, one particularly memorable case involved a rival within the Florentine government who had been undermining my initiatives and attempting to discredit my competence. Rather than engaging in direct political warfare, I approached him with a proposal for collaboration on a project that served both our interests, reform of the militia system. I began by acknowledging his expertise in military affairs and expressing genuine interest in his ideas for improvement. This surprised him because he expected continued hostility. I then proposed that we work together on specific, limited reforms where our visions aligned. As these collaborations succeeded, we discovered that we shared more common ground than either of us had realized. Eventually, I offered him a position of leadership in the new militia structure that satisfied his ambitions while serving Florence's needs. By the end of this process, he had become one of my strongest supporters, and his conversion sent a powerful message to other potential enemies about the benefits of cooperation versus the costs of continued hostility. However, enemy conversion requires extreme caution about timing and circumstances. Attempts at conversion from positions of weakness are often interpreted as desperation and can actually strengthen your enemy's resolve to continue fighting. Conversion works best when negotiated from positions of strength, when your enemy respects your capabilities and recognizes that continued conflict might be costly, even if they eventually win. The most sophisticated form of enemy conversion involves helping your enemy achieve their legitimate goals through means that also serve your interests. This requires deep understanding of what they really want versus what they say they want, and creative thinking about solutions that appear to give them what they need, while actually strengthening your position. I learned that converted enemies often become the most loyal allies because they have personal experience of your character under pressure. They know you are capable of defeating them, which makes them respect your strength. They also know you chose alliance over destruction when you had the option, which makes them trust your wisdom and restraint. But remember that conversion is not always possible or advisable. Some enemies are too dangerous to trust. Some conflicts are too fundamental to resolve through negotiation, and some situations require decisive victory rather than diplomatic accommodation. The skill lies in recognizing which enemies can be converted, when conversion serves your strategic interests, and how to execute the transformation without appearing weak or naive. When mastered, enemy conversion becomes one of your most powerful tools. Each enemy you convert not only eliminates a threat, but adds strength to your position. More importantly, the reputation for being able to convert enemies through strength and wisdom deters others from becoming enemies in the first place, because they see that you offer a path to honorable resolution for those wise enough to take it. While converting enemies is an advanced skill, building an impenetrable reputation is a fundamental necessity that protects you from countless enemies who never materialize because they fear to challenge you. Your reputation is like a fortress that surrounds you at all times, deterring attacks, attracting allies, and ensuring that when conflicts do arise, you begin from a position of strength. The marble bust I kept in my study served as a daily reminder of this principle. Unlike flesh, which weakens with age and injury, a properly crafted reputation grows stronger over time and can withstand assaults that would destroy the person behind it. A great reputation makes enemies hesitate, allies rally, and neutral parties assume your eventual victory even before conflicts begin. I learned the power of reputation by watching how different leaders navigated identical challenges with vastly different outcomes. Some faced constant rebellions, betrayals, and power struggles despite having superior resources and intelligence. Others maintained order and loyalty with seemingly minimal effort. The difference was rarely in their actual capabilities. It was in how their capabilities were perceived and what that perception meant for others' strategic calculations. Reputation operates on 3 levels, each serving different defensive functions. Personal reputation affects how individuals relate to you, whether they fear your wrath, respect your judgment, trust your word, or doubt your resolve. Institutional reputation affects how organizations and groups position themselves relative to you, whether they seek alliance, maintain neutrality, or risk opposition. Historical reputation affects how your actions are interpreted within the broader context of past patterns and future expectations. Building an effective reputation fortress requires understanding that reputation is not simply about being liked or admired. It is about being predictable in specific ways that serve your strategic interests. Your enemies need to be able to predict that challenging you will be costly, that betraying you will be punished, and that opposing you will ultimately fail. Your allies need to be able to predict that supporting you will be rewarded, that trusting you will be honored, and that joining your cause will lead to shared victory. The foundation of any strong reputation is consistency between your stated principles and your actual behavior. When people can predict how you will respond to specific situations based on your established patterns, they can make informed calculations about whether to support or oppose you. Unpredictability may occasionally provide tactical advantages, but it undermines the strategic deterrent effect of reputation. I developed what I called the 4 pillars of reputation that support effective deterrence. The first pillar is competence, the belief that you have the skills, knowledge, and judgment necessary to achieve your stated goals. Enemies who believe you are competent approach conflict with you much more cautiously than those who believe you are incompetent. The second pillar is resolve, the belief that you will follow through on commitments, threats, and promises despite obstacles or costs. Enemies who believe you lack resolve will test your boundaries constantly, while those who believe in your determination will often choose accommodation over confrontation. The third pillar is resource access, the belief that you can sustain prolonged conflicts and that attacking you will require significant investment with uncertain returns. This doesn't necessarily mean you need vast wealth or armies, but you do need credible access to whatever resources are relevant in your particular context. The fourth pillar is network strength, the belief that you have reliable allies who will support you in conflicts and that attacking you means potentially creating multiple enemies rather than just one. Strong networks multiply your apparent power and make aggression against you seem prohibitively expensive. The most sophisticated aspect of reputation building is what I call calibrated demonstration. This involves periodically taking actions that reinforce your reputation in ways that serve immediate tactical purposes while strengthening long-term strategic deterrence. During my time in the Florentine Chancery, I made sure that my responses to smaller challenges clearly demonstrated the 4 pillars of my reputation. When junior clerks attempted to circumvent proper procedures, I responded with precisely calibrated consequences that showed competence in detecting violations, resolve in enforcing standards, access to institutional authority, and support from colleagues who valued proper order. These responses served immediate purposes, maintaining administrative efficiency and respect for proper channels, but they also sent signals to more significant potential enemies that challenging me would trigger predictable and proportionate responses backed by genuine capability. The key to calibrated demonstration is ensuring that your responses are proportionate to the challenges. Overreacting to minor threats makes you appear unstable and wastes resources that should be preserved for serious conflicts. Underreacting to significant challenges makes you appear weak and invites escalation. The goal is to respond to each challenge with exactly the level of force necessary to resolve it, while demonstrating your capacity for greater force if required. One of the most powerful reputation-building techniques is what I call protective escalation. When enemies test your boundaries with small provocations, you respond not just to the immediate provocation, but to the implied threat behind it. This demonstrates that you understand the strategic implications of seemingly minor challenges, and that you will address patterns of behavior before they become serious problems. However, reputation building must be balanced with accessibility and reasonableness. A reputation for being impossible to work with or negotiate with can actually encourage preemptive attacks by enemies who believe that accommodation is impossible. The most effective reputation combines strength with fairness, the belief that you will be reasonable with those who approach you reasonably, but formidable against those who choose hostility. I learned that reputation maintenance requires constant attention because reputations can be damaged by single failures or sustained by single successes more dramatically than people expect. A well-established reputation for competence can survive occasional mistakes, but a newly built reputation can be destroyed by one significant failure. Conversely, a single impressive victory can establish a reputation that deters future challenges. For years, the modern applications of reputation building are more important than ever in environments where information travels quickly and first impressions often become lasting impressions. Your reputation precedes you into every room, every negotiation, and every relationship. People make decisions about how to treat you based on what they believe about your character, capabilities, and connections before they have any direct experience with you. When your reputation fortress is properly constructed and maintained, most of your enemies defeat themselves through their own hesitation and fear. They see the costs of challenging you, doubt their chances of success, and choose to direct their ambitions toward easier targets. This is the ultimate victory, winning conflicts that never begin because potential enemies conclude that discretion is indeed the better part of valor. While a strong reputation deters many enemies, those who remain undeterred often require more than individual effort to defeat. This is where the art of alliance building and proxy warfare becomes essential. No matter how capable you are individually, facing organized enemies without organized support is a luxury only the foolish can afford. The treaty scroll that adorned my wall reminded me daily of a fundamental truth. Every great victory in history has been achieved through multiplication of force rather than pure individual effort. Even the mightiest conquerors succeeded not through personal prowess alone, but through their ability to harness the capabilities of others toward common purposes. I learned this lesson definitively during Florence's conflicts with more powerful neighbors. When Milan threatened our independence, we could never have survived through our own military strength alone. Our salvation came through careful alliance building with Venice and France, creating a coalition that made the cost of conquering Florence prohibitively expensive for Milan, even though Milan remained stronger than any single member of our alliance. The principle of strategic alliance rests on a simple but profound insight. Your enemy's enemies are your natural allies, but only if you can offer them something valuable in return for their support. Alliance building is not charity. It is mutual investment in shared strategic interests. There are three types of alliances that serve different purposes in enemy management. Defensive alliances protect you against attacks by making aggression against you more costly and complicated. Offensive alliances enable you to take action against enemies that would be impossible to defeat alone. Balance alliances prevent any single enemy from becoming so powerful that they can dominate all other players in your environment. The most effective defensive alliances are those where your allies have independent reasons to oppose your enemies, beyond simple friendship with you. When your allies share genuine strategic interests in preventing your defeat, they will commit real resources to your protection, even when supporting you becomes costly or dangerous. I cultivated defensive alliances by identifying other parties who would be threatened by my enemy's success, even if they had no particular affection for me personally. When rival families in Florence attempted to undermine my position, I built relationships with other officials who would be vulnerable to the same tactics if my enemies succeeded in using them against me. Offensive alliances require even more careful construction because they involve asking others to take risks and expend resources for goals that may not directly benefit them. The key is framing offensive action in terms of defensive necessity, showing potential allies that your enemy's continued existence or success poses a long-term threat to their own security and interests. During my diplomatic missions, I observed how the most successful military alliances were built around shared fears rather than shared ambitions. Venice and France allied with Florence against Milan, not because they loved Florence, but because they feared a Milan that controlled Florence would become too powerful to contain. The most sophisticated alliance strategy involves what I call triangular positioning, building relationships that make you valuable to multiple parties who may themselves be neutral or even hostile toward each other. This gives you options and leverage while preventing any single ally from taking your support for granted. But even more powerful than direct alliances is the use of proxy warfare, encouraging others to fight your enemies while you remain apparently uninvolved. This allows you to weaken your enemies without suffering the costs and risks of direct confrontation, while maintaining plausible deniability about your role in their difficulties. Proxy warfare works best when you can identify parties that have independent grievances against your enemies and provide them with support, information, or encouragement that makes their natural hostility more effective. You become a force multiplier for conflicts that would happen anyway, but might otherwise be ineffective. I employed proxy tactics against several rivals by providing information and strategic advice to their other enemies, encouraging those enemies to press their grievances more effectively than they would have otherwise. My rivals found themselves fighting multiple battles simultaneously, never quite able to prove my involvement, but gradually weakened by the constant pressure. The most elegant proxy warfare involves helping your enemy's existing opponents succeed rather than creating new enemies for them. This appears less manipulative and is harder to trace back to you, while achieving the same strategic objectives of weakening those who oppose you. However, alliance building and proxy warfare require careful attention to long-term consequences. Today's ally may become tomorrow's enemy if your interests diverge, and today's proxy may turn their enhanced capabilities against you once your common enemy is defeated. Successful alliance strategy requires constant evaluation of whether relationships continue to serve your interests and adjustment of your commitments accordingly. I learned to structure alliances with clear understandings about the specific purposes they serve and the conditions under which they might end. This prevented allies from developing unrealistic expectations about permanent mutual support and reduced the likelihood that alliance dissolution would create new enemies. The most sophisticated practitioners of alliance strategy maintain multiple, simultaneous relationships that serve different functions, some primarily defensive, some primarily offensive, some focused on intelligence sharing, others focused on resource access. This diversification prevents overdependence on any single relationship while maximizing your strategic options. Modern applications of these principles are everywhere around us. In any competitive environment, the individuals who succeed long-term are those who build networks of mutually beneficial relationships, who position themselves as valuable allies to multiple parties and who understand how to encourage others to advance shared interests without appearing manipulative or self-serving. Remember that alliance building is not about accumulating friends or popularity. It is about creating strategic relationships that enhance your capability to achieve your objectives while reducing the capability of your enemies to achieve theirs. When properly constructed, your alliance network becomes a force multiplier that transforms every conflict from a test of individual strength into a test of coalition power, where victory goes not to the strongest individual, but to the most strategically connected. There comes a moment in every conflict when defense and deterrence are no longer sufficient, when enemies have committed themselves to courses of action that cannot be negotiated away or ignored. In these moments, you must transition from defensive strategy to offensive action, not in rage or desperation, but with calculated precision that ensures your counterattack achieves decisive results rather than merely escalating the conflict. The Florentine banner that hung in my office served as a constant reminder of the military campaigns I had witnessed, where the difference between victory and defeat often lay not in the initial engagement, but in how commanders responded when the battle turned against them. The greatest generals were those who could absorb enemy attacks, learn from them, and then strike back with devastating effectiveness. I learned the principles of strategic counterattack through bitter experience. Early in my career, when rivals attempted to undermine my position in the government, my initial instinct was either to ignore their attacks or to respond with equivalent force. Both approaches failed catastrophically. Ignoring attacks encouraged escalation, while matching force created prolonged conflicts that weakened all parties and benefited only outside observers. The counterattack doctrine rests on a fundamental principle: when you must fight, fight to win decisively rather than fighting to demonstrate your willingness to fight. Half measures in conflict create surviving enemies who are now both hostile and experienced in your methods. Complete measures create examples that deter future aggression while eliminating current threats. But decisive counterattack requires precise timing and overwhelming force concentration. You cannot simply respond to every provocation with maximum force. This depletes your resources and makes you appear unstable. Instead, you must choose your moments carefully, allowing smaller provocations to accumulate until your response appears not just justified, but necessary for your survival. I developed what I call the three-phase counterattack sequence. Phase 1 is absorption, taking the initial attacks while appearing to struggle, which encourages your enemies to commit more resources and reveal more of their capabilities and intentions than they would if you responded immediately. This phase requires exceptional discipline because every instinct screams for immediate retaliation. During the absorption phase, you are actually gathering intelligence, identifying all participants in the attack against you, understanding their coordination, methods, and preparing your response. Your apparent weakness during this phase is strategic deception, designed to maximize the effectiveness of your eventual response. Phase 2 is preparation, using the time your enemies spend celebrating their apparent success to position yourself for devastating response. This includes securing additional resources, building support for your cause, identifying your enemy's vulnerabilities that have been revealed during their attack, and timing your response for maximum impact. The key insight is that enemies often become overconfident and careless during their initial success. They may reveal information they meant to keep secret, alienate potential supporters through their methods, or extend themselves beyond sustainable positions. Your preparation phase should exploit all these opportunities while appearing to be struggling with their initial attacks. Phase 3 is execution, striking back with sufficient force to not only reverse your immediate situation, but to permanently discourage future attacks from the same enemies or similar threats. This is not about revenge, though it may feel satisfying. It is about creating lasting deterrence through demonstration of your ultimate capabilities. During my conflicts with rivals in the Florentine Chancery, I employed this sequence against a group that had been systematically undermining my policy recommendations and spreading rumors about my competence. Rather than responding to each individual attack, I allowed them to escalate their campaign while I documented their activities and built support among officials who valued institutional stability. When I finally responded, it was not with equivalent criticism or rumors, but with a comprehensive presentation to the governing council that exposed their entire campaign, demonstrated how their tactics threatened governmental effectiveness, and resulted in disciplinary action that ended their careers in public service. The documentation I had gathered during the absorption phase made their guilt undeniable, while my restraint during that period made my eventual response appear necessary rather than vindictive. The most sophisticated aspect of counterattack doctrine is what I call escalation calculus, ensuring that your response is more devastating to your enemies than their attack was to you, while remaining proportionate enough that neutral observers see justice rather than tyranny in your actions. This requires understanding not just the immediate damage your enemies have inflicted, but the precedent their attack represents and the encouragement their success would provide to other potential enemies. Your counterattack must address not only the immediate threat, but the broader strategic environment that allowed such attacks to seem attractive to your enemies. I learned that the most effective counterattacks are those that appear to be natural, consequences of your enemy's actions rather than arbitrary punishment from you. When enemies destroy themselves through the logical results of their own behavior, your role appears to be simply allowing justice to take its course, rather than imposing your will through force. This often means structuring your counterattack so that your enemies' own methods and allies turn against them. If they have built their attack on deception, expose the deception in ways that make their supporters feel manipulated. If they have built their attack on coalition, reveal information that fractures the coalition. If they have built their attack on institutional authority, demonstrate how they have violated the principles of that authority. The timing of counterattack execution is crucial. Too early, and you appear to be the aggressor rather than the victim defending himself. Too late, and your enemies may have consolidated their gains beyond reversal. The optimal timing is usually when your enemies have committed irreversibly to their course of action, but before they have achieved their ultimate objectives. While psychological warfare can achieve victory through enemy self-defeat, there are times when circumstances demand direct and final action. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of enemy management to master, because it requires making life-altering decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure. The final strike philosophy is not about violence. It is about decisive action that permanently resolves conflicts rather than temporarily suppressing them. The executioner's acts that I contemplated during my darkest moments in exile reminded me of an uncomfortable truth. Half measures in dealing with truly dangerous enemies often create more suffering than decisive action. When enemies are committed to your destruction and cannot be deterred, converted, or contained through other means, attempting to preserve them often preserves the conflict itself, leading to prolonged suffering for everyone involved. I learned this principle through studying the rise and fall of Italian princes who faced existential threats to their rule. Those who survived were often not the most merciful or the most loved, but those who recognized when mercy had become dangerous and acted accordingly. Those who fell frequently did so because they hesitated to take decisive action when it could have prevented greater tragedies. The most instructive example was Duke Cesare Borgia's handling of the conspiracy among his condottieri. When he discovered that his own military commanders were plotting against him, he faced a choice: attempt to negotiate with men who had already decided he must die, or eliminate the threat completely and decisively. He chose the latter, and though history judges him harshly for his methods, his decisive action prevented a civil war that would have devastated the Romagna and cost thousands of lives. The final strike philosophy rests on several uncomfortable realities about human nature and conflict resolution. First, some enemies cannot be reformed, converted, or contained. Their hostility toward you serves psychological needs that rational negotiation cannot address. Second, enemies who survive failed attempts at their destruction often become more dangerous because they learn from their mistakes while maintaining their original motivations. Third, prolonged conflicts consume resources and attention that could be directed toward constructive purposes. However, the decision to apply final strike measures requires meeting extremely strict criteria. The enemy must pose a genuine existential threat, not merely an inconvenience or a competitive challenge. Alternative solutions must have been attempted and proven inadequate. The enemy must have demonstrated through their actions, not just their words, that they are committed to your destruction, regardless of what accommodations you might offer. Most importantly, you must have clear evidence that the enemy will continue to pose threats in the future based on their fundamental nature rather than their current circumstances. Enemies driven by temporary conditions can often be managed through changes in those conditions. Enemies driven by deep psychological needs or ideological commitments typically cannot be managed except through elimination of their capability to act on those drives. The moral calculation involved in final strike decisions is complex and personal. I developed a framework based on proportionality and responsibility. The action taken must be proportionate to the threat posed. You cannot justify extreme measures against minor threats. You must also consider your responsibility to others who depend on you for protection. Sometimes the failure to act decisively against genuine threats represents a betrayal of those who trust you to safeguard their interests. During my time observing Florentine politics, I witnessed several situations where leaders' reluctance to take decisive action against confirmed enemies ultimately led to greater suffering than would have resulted from earlier, more complete resolution of the conflicts. The desire to appear merciful or to avoid difficult decisions often prolonged conflicts that consumed resources and destroyed innocent lives. The execution of final strike measures requires careful planning to ensure completeness and minimize collateral damage. Incomplete action that leaves enemies partially capable of retaliation often triggers desperate responses that cause more harm than the original threat. The goal is not to create suffering, but to eliminate threats so completely that future conflict becomes impossible. I learned that the most effective final strikes are those that appear to be natural consequences of the enemy's own actions rather than arbitrary punishment from you. When enemies destroy themselves through the logical results of their choices, the moral responsibility lies primarily with them rather than with you for allowing natural justice to take its course. This often means structuring situations so that enemies' continued hostility creates escalating costs for them while your role remains primarily defensive. You create conditions where their persistence in hostile action becomes unsustainable, forcing them to abandon their efforts or face consequences that you did not directly impose but did not prevent. The psychological toll of implementing final strike measures should not be underestimated. Even when such actions are necessary and justified, they change you as a person. The knowledge that you are capable of decisive action when required affects how others relate to you and how you relate to yourself. This is not necessarily negative, but it is permanent. Modern applications of final strike philosophy are more subtle than historical examples, but equally important. In any competitive environment, there are times when decisive action becomes necessary to permanently resolve conflicts that cannot be managed through other means. This might involve legal action that ends someone's career, strategic moves that eliminate competitive threats, or organizational changes that remove persistent sources of problems. The key principles remain the same. Final measures should be reserved for genuine threats that cannot be managed through other means. They should be implemented completely enough to prevent retaliation, and they should be structured to appear as natural consequences of the enemy's choices rather than arbitrary exercises of power. Remember that the reputation for being capable of decisive action when necessary often prevents the circumstances that would make such action required. Enemies who believe you will ultimately do whatever is necessary to protect yourself and your interests are much less likely to commit themselves to courses of action that would require you to prove that belief correct. While the final strike philosophy addresses how to handle existing enemies who cannot be managed through other means, true strategic mastery involves designing your environment to prevent new enemies from forming in the first place. This is the highest level of enemy management, creating systems and relationships that make hostility toward you either impossible or unprofitable for potential opponents. The fortress design that I studied during my military engineering work taught me that the most effective defensive systems are those that discourage attacks rather than merely repelling them. A fortress that must constantly fight off sieges will eventually fall through attrition, no matter how strong its walls. A fortress positioned and designed so that siege appears pointless to potential attackers may stand unconquered for centuries. Learn the principles of enemy prevention through careful observation of leaders who seem to glide through politics without creating the usual trail of bitter opponents that most ambitious people accumulate. These individuals were not necessarily more talented or virtuous than their peers, but they structured their rise to power in ways that minimize the creation of permanent enemies. The foundation of enemy prevention is understanding that most hostility develops not from inherent evil in others, but from structural conflicts of interest that make opposition seem rational or necessary. When your success directly threatens others' security, status, or aspirations, they have logical reasons to oppose you regardless of their personal feelings about your character. The first principle of prevention is resource abundance creation. When there are insufficient resources, positions, or opportunities for everyone who wants them, competition naturally becomes hostile as participants realize that others' success means their failure. But when you can structure situations so that your success creates opportunities for others rather than eliminating them, competition becomes collaboration. During my diplomatic work, I observed how the most successful negotiators were those who found ways to make agreements appear beneficial to all parties rather than zero-sum transactions where one side's gain required the other's loss. These negotiators rarely created lasting enemies because even unsuccessful counterparts left the process believing that future cooperation might serve their interests. I applied this principle in my own career by ensuring that my advancement in government service created opportunities for colleagues rather than threatening their positions. When I developed new administrative procedures, I designed them to enhance others' effectiveness rather than replace their functions. When I gained access to powerful figures, I used that access to advocate for colleagues' projects as well as my own. The second principle is preemptive relationship building. Most enemies begin as neutral parties who gradually develop hostility through a series of negative interactions or misunderstandings. By investing in positive relationships before conflicts arise, you create buffers that prevent minor disagreements from escalating into permanent opposition. This requires systematics, attention to building goodwill with people who might become enemies if circumstances change. You cannot predict exactly which neutral parties will become threats, so you must invest broadly in maintaining positive relationships even when immediate benefits are not apparent. I made it a practice to regularly communicate with potential rivals, offering assistance with their projects when possible, acknowledging their achievements publicly, and seeking their advice on matters within their expertise. This investment often prevented competitive situations from becoming hostile and sometimes converted potential enemies into allies when their interests aligned with mine. The third principle is transparency in motivation and method. Much enemy formation results from others' fears about your hidden agenda or uncertainty about your intentions. When people understand what you want and how you plan to achieve it, they can make rational calculations about whether to support or oppose you. When they must guess about your motivations, they often assume the worst. I learned to be extremely clear about my objectives and methods, even when this transparency seemed to provide advantages to competitors. The benefits of reduced suspicion and improved predictability almost always outweighed the tactical disadvantages of revealing information about my plans. The fourth principle is institutional alignment. When your methods and objectives align with established institutions and accepted values, opposing you requires opposing those institutions and values as well. This makes hostility toward you much more costly and risky for potential enemies. Rather than trying to change systems to suit my purposes, I learned to advance my interests through methods that strengthened existing institutions and reinforced accepted principles. This made opposition to me appear destructive to institutional stability rather than merely competitive with my personal ambitions. The fifth principle is exit provision. Some conflicts are inevitable regardless of your prevention efforts, but many can be resolved before they become permanent hostilities if you provide face-saving ways for potential enemies to withdraw from confrontation. People often escalate conflicts not because they want to fight, but because they cannot see honorable ways to avoid fighting. I made it a practice to always leave opponents with acceptable alternatives to continued hostility. Even when I had clear advantages in conflicts, I offered resolution terms that allowed opponents to preserve dignity and pursue their objectives through non-hostile means. The most sophisticated prevention strategy involves what I call ecological design, structuring your entire environment so that the natural incentives encourage cooperation and discourage hostility. This goes beyond individual relationship management to include institutional reforms, resource allocation systems, and communication structures that make collaboration more profitable than competition. Modern applications of these principles are especially important in environments where reputation travels quickly and past conflicts can haunt future opportunities. The professionals who build lasting success are those who leave each interaction with potential for future positive relationships, even when immediate objectives conflict. Prevention requires more initial investment than reaction, but it pays enormous dividends over time. Every enemy you prevent from forming is a conflict you never have to fight, resources you never have to expend on defense, and energy you can direct toward constructive purposes rather than destructive ones. Remember, that enemy prevention is not about avoiding all conflict or always prioritizing others' interests over your own. It is about designing your approach to achieving your objectives so that others' rational self-interest supports rather than opposes your success. When cooperation serves everyone's interests better than competition, most people will choose cooperation, and those who don't will find themselves isolated rather than supported in their hostility. While prevention strategies reduce the formation of new enemies, leadership itself requires understanding one of the most controversial aspects of power: the strategic use of fear as a tool for maintaining order and authority. This is perhaps the most misunderstood principle in all of political philosophy, yet mastering it is essential for anyone who must lead others in competitive or dangerous environments. The lion and fox medallion that I wore during diplomatic missions represented the dual nature of effective leadership: the strength of the lion that commands respect through capability, and the cunning of the fox that achieves objectives through intelligence. But both creatures share a common characteristic: they inspire a healthy fear in other animals that prevents most conflicts before they begin. I learned this principle through painful experience with the limitations of pure benevolence in leadership. Early in my career, I believed that being consistently generous, fair, and considerate would create loyalty and prevent opposition. I discovered instead that such approaches, while admirable in personal relationships, often create instability in leadership contexts because they fail to deter those who would exploit kindness as weakness. The fundamental insight is that human beings are motivated by both positive and negative incentives, and leadership that relies exclusively on positive incentives often fails because it cannot effectively discourage destructive behavior from the minority who are willing to abuse others' generosity for personal gain. Controlled fear is not about terrorizing subordinates or creating anxiety-based work environments. It is about ensuring that people understand there are genuine consequences for actions that threaten organizational effectiveness, institutional integrity, or the welfare of others who depend on your leadership for protection. I observed this principle in action when studying the most effective military commanders during various Italian campaigns. The officers whose units maintained discipline and effectiveness over long periods were those who combined genuine care for their soldiers' welfare with absolute certainty about consequences for actions that endangered unit cohesion or mission success. These commanders were often beloved by their troops precisely because their willingness to enforce standards protected good soldiers from the consequences of bad soldiers' behavior. Their controlled use of fear created environments where cooperation was rewarded and exploitation was impossible, making their units safer and more successful than those led by either pure authoritarians or pure democrats. The key to controlled fear is proportionality and predictability. People must understand exactly what behaviors will trigger negative consequences. Those consequences must be proportionate to the infractions, and the application of consequences must be consistent regardless of personal relationships or temporary circumstances. During my administrative work in Florence, I developed what I called the three-tier consequence system. Minor infractions that showed poor judgment but didn't harm others received private correction and additional training. Moderate infractions that created problems for colleagues or compromised institutional effectiveness received public correction and formal documentation. Serious infractions that threatened institutional integrity or endangered others received immediate removal from positions of responsibility. This system worked because everyone understood the standards and consequences. In advance, the progression was logical and fair, and enforcement was consistent. People could make informed decisions about their behavior based on clear information about probable outcomes. The most sophisticated application of controlled fear involves what I call anticipatory deterrence, structuring situations so that people understand the consequences of negative behavior without having to experience those consequences directly. When people see that certain actions predictably lead to specific outcomes, most will choose behaviors that lead to positive outcomes rather than testing whether the negative outcomes are real. I employed this technique by ensuring that the consequences of policy violations were visible and understood throughout the organization. When someone did face consequences for misconduct, I made sure that the connection between their actions and outcomes was clear to everyone else, not as a threat, but as information that helped others make better decisions. However, controlled. Fear must be balanced with genuine opportunity for positive recognition and advancement. Fear alone creates compliance, but not excellence, and compliance without commitment is fragile when circumstances become difficult. The most effective leaders combine clear consequences for negative behavior with meaningful rewards for positive contributions. I learned that the optimal leadership environment is one where people feel safe from arbitrary punishment, but understand that genuine misconduct will have predictable consequences, where they feel challenged to excellence but supported in their efforts to achieve it, and where they respect your capability to protect them from external threats while knowing you will not tolerate internal threats to group welfare. The most common mistake in applying this principle is allowing personal relationships to create exceptions to established standards. When leaders fail to enforce consequences consistently because of friendship, favoritism, or fear of conflict, they undermine the entire system that makes controlled fear effective as a leadership tool. I observed many leaders destroy their own authority by making exceptions for people they liked or feared confronting. These exceptions taught everyone else that standards were negotiable and consequences were uncertain, which eliminated the predictability that makes controlled fear work as a deterrent to negative behavior. Another critical mistake is escalating to maximum consequences too quickly rather than allowing the progressive system to work. When leaders impose severe consequences for minor infractions, they appear unstable and arbitrary rather than strong and principled. This creates genuine fear rather than controlled fear, and genuine fear often motivates resistance rather than compliance. Modern applications of controlled fear are essential in any leadership context where the actions of individuals can affect the welfare of groups. The managers who maintain high performance and group cohesion over time are those who create environments where people understand that excellence is rewarded, mediocrity is tolerated temporarily with support for improvement, and misconduct is addressed swiftly and proportionately. Remember that the goal of controlled fear is not to make people afraid of you personally, but to make them confident that negative behavior will have predictable consequences, while positive behavior will be recognized and rewarded. When people trust your judgment and consistency, they often view your willingness to enforce standards as protection rather than threat, because they know that such enforcement creates safer and more productive environments for everyone who is committed to constructive participation. Now that you understand the fundamental principles of enemy management as I learned them in Renaissance Italy, you must translate these ancient insights into the modern contexts where you actually live and work. The battlefield has changed dramatically since my time, but human nature remains remarkably consistent, and the principles that governed conflict 500 years ago continue to govern conflict today. The modern battlefield map that I would draw today would show corporate offices instead of city-states, social media platforms instead of public squares, and professional networks instead of military alliances. Yet the same strategic thinking that enabled survival and success in my era can enable survival and success in yours, if you understand how to adapt timeless principles to contemporary circumstances. In the modern business environment, the principles of enemy identification are more relevant than ever. Your open enemies are obvious competitors who operate in your industry and compete for the same customers, resources, or market positions. These competitors may be aggressive, but they are predictable because their strategies and objectives are generally visible through their public actions and stated goals. Your hidden enemies in business contexts are often colleagues within your own organization who smile at your successes while working to undermine your position, reputation, or advancement opportunities. These internal threats are far more dangerous than external competitors because they have access to information about your plan's weaknesses and vulnerabilities that competitors cannot obtain. Your potential enemies are those whose current neutrality could transform into hostility if circumstances change. Suppliers who might integrate forward into your business, customers who might develop competing solutions, or partners who might decide your success threatens their independence. Identifying and monitoring these potential threats allows you to influence their calculations before they commit to hostile action. The principle of never showing weakness applies directly to professional environments where perception often becomes reality. When you face setbacks, failures, or resource constraints, your response to these challenges shapes how others assess your capabilities and future prospects. Maintaining composure and projecting confidence during difficulties prevents competitors from seeing opportunities to exploit your temporary vulnerabilities. This doesn't mean hiding all problems or pretending everything is perfect when it isn't. It means framing challenges as temporary obstacles that you are actively addressing rather than fundamental weaknesses that compromise your position permanently. The goal is to control the narrative around your difficulties so that others see resilience rather than vulnerability. Strategic patience in modern contexts often involves waiting for market conditions, technology developments, or organizational changes that improve your competitive position before making major moves against enemies. The business leaders who survive and thrive long-term are those who can endure temporary disadvantages while positioning themselves for decisive action when circumstances become favorable. Modern applications of divide and conquer are everywhere in competitive business environments. When facing coalitions of competitors, suppliers, or even internal opposition groups, the principle remains the same. Identify competing interests within the coalition and create situations where those internal tensions become more important than their shared opposition to you. This might involve offering exclusive partnerships to some members of a competitor coalition, providing information that creates suspicion about different members' commitments to shared goals, or simply being patient while natural conflicts of interest cause coalition members to prioritize their individual success over group solidarity. Information warfare has become dramatically more important and more complex in the digital age. Your ability to gather intelligence about competitors, market trends, and customer preferences often determines your competitive success more than traditional factors like price or product quality. Modern information gathering involves monitoring competitors' digital footprints, analyzing their hiring patterns, tracking their customer feedback, and understanding their strategic partnerships. The organizations that invest systematically in competitive intelligence often gain advantages that appear almost magical to those who operate with limited information. Equally important is controlling the information environment around your own organization. This involves not just traditional marketing and public relations, but strategic communication about your capabilities, intentions, and achievements that shapes how competitors, customers, and potential partners assess opportunities to work with or against you. Social media and professional networks have created new opportunities for reputation building that didn't exist in my era. Your digital presence becomes a 24/7 projection of your professional brand that influences how others relate to you before they have any direct experience with your capabilities. The principles of alliance building translate directly into modern networking and partnership strategies. The professionals who achieve the most success are those who systematically build relationships that provide mutual benefits, create value for others while advancing their own objectives, and position themselves as valuable connections between other people who can benefit from knowing each other. Modern proxy warfare often involves encouraging others to advocate for your interests or oppose your enemies without requiring direct confrontation between you and your opponents. This might involve supporting industry associations that advance your policy preferences, providing information to journalists who cover your competitors, or building relationships with customers who become advocates for your solutions. The counterattack doctrine applies to situations where competitors have taken aggressive action against your market position, reputation, or business relationships. The same principles of absorption, preparation, and decisive response work in modern contexts, though the execution methods involve legal strategies, marketing campaigns, or competitive innovations rather than military tactics. Psychological warfare in modern business involves creating doubt in competitors' minds about their strategies, market positions, or internal capabilities. This is often accomplished through strategic communication about your own capabilities, customer testimonials that highlight competitor weaknesses, or competitive intelligence that reveals market trends unfavorable to competitor strategies. Modern applications of these principles require understanding that business competition, like political conflict, involves human psychology as much as objective capabilities. The competitors who succeed long-term are those who understand how to manage not just their own strategies, but the perceptions and decision-making processes of everyone else in their competitive environment. Remember that the fundamental goal remains the same as it was in my era: achieving your objectives while minimizing the costs and risks of conflict with those who oppose you. The methods have evolved, but the underlying strategic principles that enabled survival and success in Renaissance Italy continue to enable survival and success in contemporary competitive environments. As we reach the end of our journey together, I want you to understand that mastering these principles is not the conclusion of your education in strategic dominance. It is merely the foundation upon which you will build a lifetime of increasingly sophisticated application. The manuscript of The Prince that I completed during my exile represents not just my observations about power, but my gift to future generations who must navigate the eternal challenges of human conflict and competition. You now possess knowledge that took me decades to acquire through observation, experience, and often painful trial and error. You understand how to identify enemies before they become dangerous, how to project strength even during difficult periods, how to wait for optimal moments to act, and how to structure your environment to prevent unnecessary conflicts from developing. More importantly, you understand that strategic dominance is not about becoming a tyrant or destroying everyone who opposes you. It is about achieving your legitimate objectives while minimizing the suffering and waste that comes from poorly managed conflicts. When you apply these principles wisely, you often prevent more violence than you create, protect more people than you threaten, and build more value than you destroy. The integration of these principles into your personal philosophy requires understanding that they are tools to be used in service of worthy goals, not goals in themselves. The pursuit of power without purpose leads to the kind of tyranny that ultimately destroys itself. The pursuit of worthy purposes with strategic intelligence leads to achievements that benefit not just yourself, but everyone whose welfare depends on your success. As you begin applying what you have learned, remember that mastery comes through practice, reflection, and continuous refinement of your approach. You will make mistakes. I certainly made many, but each mistake becomes valuable if you learn from it and adjust your methods accordingly. The goal is not perfection, but continuous improvement in your ability to navigate human conflict effectively and ethically. Start with small applications of these principles in low-stakes situations where errors will not have serious consequences. Practice identifying potential enemies in your professional environment. Experiment with strategic patience in minor conflicts, and observe how different approaches to reputation building affect others' behavior toward you. Pay special attention to the psychological dimensions of strategic interaction. Most people focus primarily on objective factors like resources, capabilities, and formal authority while neglecting the subjective factors like perception, confidence, and emotional dynamics that often determine outcomes more decisively than objective advantages. As your skills develop, you will find that others begin to relate to you differently. Some will be attracted to your competence and confidence, seeking alliance and mentorship. Others will be intimidated by your effectiveness, keeping respectful distance while avoiding direct confrontation. A few may be challenged by your success, testing your resolve and capabilities through various forms of competition. All of these responses are natural and manageable if you apply the principles we have discussed. The key is maintaining perspective about your ultimate objectives while remaining flexible about your methods for achieving them. Circumstances change, people change, and effective strategy requires continuous adaptation to evolving conditions. The responsibility that comes with these capabilities is significant. When you can identify enemies accurately, manage conflicts effectively, and achieve your objectives through strategic intelligence, others will often turn to you for leadership and protection. This responsibility should be embraced thoughtfully, because your decisions will affect not just your own welfare, but the welfare of everyone who depends on you. Use your growing strategic capabilities to create value for others whenever possible. The most sustainable form of dominance is that which others support because it serves their interests as well as your own. When your success creates opportunities for others, generates prosperity for your community, and contributes to institutional stability, your dominance becomes welcomed rather than merely tolerated. Remember that true strategic mastery involves knowing when not to use the tools at your disposal as much as knowing how to use them. The leader who must constantly demonstrate his power probably lacks real power. The strategist who must frequently employ extreme measures probably lack sufficient skill in subtle measures. The highest level of strategic dominance is achieved when your reputation and relationships create an environment where conflicts are resolved through negotiation, where potential enemies choose cooperation over hostility, and where your objectives are achieved through influence rather than force. This is the legacy I hope you will build. Not a trail of defeated enemies, but a record of achieved objectives. Protected interests and constructive relationships that serve both your purposes and the broader good. When others look back on your career, let them see someone who understood power well enough to use it wisely, who was strong enough to be merciful when mercy served justice, and who was strategic enough to win without creating unnecessary suffering. The principles I have shared with you are now part of your intellectual arsenal. How you choose to employ them will determine not just your success, but your character and your contribution to the world. Use them well, use them wisely, and use them in service of objectives worthy of the considerable effort required to master them. The future belongs to those who understand both the timeless principles of human conflict and the evolving contexts in which those principles must be applied. You are now equipped to be among them.